but the simple root of this complicated exchange of properties, the union of the divine and human natures in one person, has also met with contradiction. The Socinians denied it on the ground that two natures, each of which alone constitutes a person, cannot be united to form a single person, especially when they possess properties so opposite, as where the one is immortal 765, the other mortal, the one uncreated, the other created 16, and the rationalists agree with them, insisting more particularly that the formal of the Church in which the above union is defined are almost entirely negative, thus presenting no conception to the mind, and that in a Christ who by the aid of a divine nature dwelling within him withstood evil, and kept himself from sin, the man who is destitute of such aid can have no true example. The essential and tenable points of the rationalistic objections to this doctrine have been the most acutely perceived and arranged by Schleiermacher, who on this subject, as on many others, has brought the negative criticism of the dogmas of the Church to completeness. Before all else, he finds it a difficulty that by the expression divine nature and human nature, divinity and humanity are placed under one category, and what is more under the category of nature, which essentially denotes only a limited being conceived by means of its opposite further, while ordinarily one nature is common to many individuals or persons. Here one person is supposed to partake of two different natures. Now, if by person be meant the permanent conscious unity of a living being, and by nature the sum of the laws which govern the conditions of life in that being, it is not to be conceived how two opposite systems of conditions can have but one center. The absurdity of this doctrine becomes, according to Schleiermacher, especially evident in the supposition of two wills in Christ, since for consistency two wills must be associated with two understandings, and as the understanding and will constitute the personality, Christ would on this supposition be inevitably divided into two persons. It is true that the two wills are supposed always to will in unison, but on the one hand there results from this only a moral, not a personal unity. On the other hand, this unison of wills is not possible relation to the divine and the human will, since the latter, which from its very essence can only exercise itself on particulars as they present themselves in succession, can as little will the same with the former, whose object is the whole in its development, as the human understanding, which acts by reasoning, can think the same with the divine understanding, which acts intuitively. Hence, it evidently follows also that a communication of properties between the two natures is not to be admitted. The doctrine of the work of Christ did not escape a similar criticism, passing over what has been objected in point of form to the division of this work into three offices. The ideas of revelation and miracles under the head of the prophetic office were chiefly called in question. It was argued that these ideas agreed neither objectively with just conceptions of God and the world in their reciprocal relation, nor subjectively with the laws of the human intellect, that the perfect God could not have created a world which from time to time needed the extraordinary interposition of the Creator, nor more particularly a human nature which was incapable of attaining its destination by the development of its innate faculties, that the immutable being could not operate on the world first in this manner, then in that, at one time immediately, at another immediately, but that he must always have operated on it in the same manner, namely in himself, and on the whole immediately, but 766 for us, and on individuals mediately, that to admit an interruption of the order of nature and of the development of humanity would be to renounce all rational thought, while in the particular case in question, a revelation or miracle is not confidently to be recognized as such, since in order to be sure that certain results have not proceeded from the powers of nature and the faculties of the human mind, a perfect knowledge of the resources of both would be requisite, and of such a knowledge man is not possessed. But the main difficulty lay in the office of high priest, attributed to Jesus, and the doctrine of the atonement, that which especially drew forth objections was the human aspect which in Anselm's system was given to the relation of God to the Son of Man, as it well becomes man to forgive offences without exacting vengeance. So thought Socinus, might God forgive the offences committed against him by men without satisfaction. To meet this objection, Hugo Grotius argued that not as in consequence of personal injuries, but to maintain the order of the moral world inviolable, or in virtue of his Justitia Rectoria, God cannot forgive sins without satisfaction. Nevertheless, granting the necessity for satisfaction, it did not appear to be met by the death of Jesus, while Anselm, and still more decidedly Thomas Aquinas, 22 spoke of a satisfactio superabundans. Socinus denied that Christ had even borne as much punishment as men have deserved, for every individual man having deserved eternal death, consequently as many substitutes as sinners ought to have suffered eternal death, whereas in this case the single Christ has suffered merely temporal death, and that as an introduction to the highest glory, nor did this death attach to his divine nature, so that it might be said to have infinite value, but only to his human nature. On the other hand, Duns Scotus 23, in opposition to Thomas and subsequently Grotius, and the Arminians equidistant from orthodoxy and Socinianism, adopted the expedient of maintaining that the merit of Christ was indeed in itself finite like its subject, his human nature, and hence was inadequate as a satisfaction for the sins of the world, but that God accepted it as adequate out of his free grace, but from the admission that God can content himself with an inadequate satisfaction, and thus can forgive a part of the guilt without satisfaction, it follows necessarily that he must also be able thus to forgive the whole. Besides these more precise definitions, however, the fundamental idea of the fabric, namely that one individual can take upon himself the punishment due to the sins of another, has been attacked as an ignorant transference of the conditions of a lower order of relation to a higher moral transgressions, it has been said, are not transmissible obligations. It is not with them, as with debts of money, which it is immaterial to the creditor who pays provided they are paid, rather it is essential to the punishment of sin that it should fall on the guilty. Only if according to this, the so-called passive obedience of Christ cannot have been vicarious, still less can his active obedience have been so, since as man he was bound to render this on his own behalf. In relation to the kingly office of Christ, the hope of his second advent, to 767, Judge the world lost ground in the sentiment of the Church, in proportion as the opinion obtained that every individual enters on a state of complete retribution immediately after death. For this opinion made the general judgment appear superfluous. The Christology of rationalism. The rationalists, rejecting the doctrine of the Church concerning Christ, his person, and his work as self-contradictory, useless, nay even hurtful to the true morality of the religious sentiment, propounded in its stead a system which, while it avoided all contradictions, yet, in a certain sense, retained for Jesus the character of a divine manifestation, which even rightly considered placed him far higher, and moreover embodied the strongest motives to practical piety. According to them, Jesus was still a divine messenger, a special favorite and charge of the deity, inasmuch as furnished by the disposition of providence with an extraordinary measure of spiritual endowment, he was born in an age and nation, and guided in a career the most favorable to his development into that for which he was destined, and especially inasmuch as he was subjected to a species of death that rendered possible his apparent resurrection, on which depended the success of his entire work, and was encompassed by a series of circumstances which actually brought that resurrection to pass. The rationalists hold that their idea of the Christ is not essentially below the orthodox one as regards his natural endowments and his external destiny, for in their view also he is the greatest man that ever trod the earth, a hero in whose fate providence is in the highest degree glorified, while as regards the internal development and free agency of Jesus they believe their doctrine essentially to surpass that of the Church. The Christ of the Church, they contend, is a mere automaton whose manhood lies under the control of his Godhead, like a lifeless instrument which acts with moral perfection, because it has no power to sin, and for this reason can neither have moral merit nor be the object of affection and reverence. According to the rationalistic view, on the contrary, Jesus had implanted in him by God the natural conditions only of that which he was ultimately to become, and his realization of this destiny was the result of his own spontaneity. His admirable wisdom he acquired by the judicious application of his intellectual powers, and the conscientious use of all the aids within his reach, his moral greatness by the zealous culture of his moral dispositions, the restraint of his sensual inclinations and passions, and a scrupulous obedience to the voice of his conscience, and on these alone rested all that was exalted in his personality, all that was encouraging in his example. As regards the work of Jesus, the rationalistic view is that he has endeared himself to mankind by this above all else, that he has taught them a religion to which, for its purity and excellence, is justly ascribed a certain divine power and dignity, and that he has illustrated and enforced this religion by the brilliant example of his own life. This prophetic office of Christ is with Socinians and rationalists the essence of his work, and to this they refer all the rest, especially what the doctrine of the Church comprehends under the office of high priest. With them, the so-called active obedience has value 768 solely, as an example, and the death of Jesus conduces to the forgiveness of sins solely by furthering the reformation of the sinner, in one of these two ways, either as a confirmation of his doctrine and a type of the devoted fulfillment of duty, it serves to kindle a zeal for virtue, or as a proof of the love of God, to man of his inclination to pardon the converted sinner. It invigorates moral courage. If Christ was no more, and did no more than this rationalistic doctrine supposes, it is not easy to see how piety has come to make him her special object, or dogmatism, to lay down special propositions. Concerning him, consistent rationalists have in fact admitted that what the orthodox dogma calls Christology forms no integral part of the rationalistic system, since this system consists indeed of a religion which Christ taught, but not of a religion of which he is the object. That viewing Christology as the doctrine of the Messiah, it is merely an accommodation to the Jewish mind that, even taken in a more noble sense, as the doctrine of the life, the actions, and the fate of Jesus as a divine messenger, it does not belong to a system of faith, for the universal truths of religion are as little connected with our ideas concerning the person of him who first enunciated them, as are the philosophical propositions in the systems of Leibniz and Wolf of Kant, Fichte and Schelling with the opinions we may happen to form of the persons of their authors, that what relates to the person and work of Jesus belongs not to religion itself, but to the history of religion, and must either be prefixed to a system of religious doctrine as an historical introduction, or appended to it as an elucidatory sequel. Accordingly, Henck in his Lineaments has removed Christology from its wonted position as an integral part of systematic theology, and has placed it as a subdivision under the head of anthropology. Thus, however, rationalism enters into open war with the Christian faith, for it seeks to thrust into the background, nay, to banish from the province of theology, that which is its essential point and cornerstone. But this very opposition is decisive of the insufficiency of the rationalistic system, proving that it does not perform what is demanded from every system of religious doctrine, namely, first to give adequate expression to the faith which is the object of the doctrine, and secondly to place this expression in a relation whether positive or negative to science. Now the rationalists, in the effort to bring the faith into harmony with science, restrict its expression for a Christ who is only a distinguished man, creates indeed no difficulty to the understanding, but is not the Christ in whom the Church believes. The eclectic Christology of Schleiermacher. It is the effort of this theologian to avoid both these ungrateful results, and, without prejudice to the faith, to form such a conception of the doctrine of the Christ as may be proof against the attacks of science. On the one hand, he has adopted in its fullest extent the negative criticism directed by rationalism against the doctrine of the Church, nay, he has rendered it even more searching. On the other hand, he has sought to retain what rationalism had lost 769, the essential part of positive Christianity. And thus he has saved many in these days from the narrowness of supernaturalism and the emptiness of rationalism. This simplification of the faith Schleiermacher effects in the following manner. He does not set out with the Protestant from the doctrine of Scripture, nor with the Catholic from the decision of the Church, for in both these ways he would have to deal with a precise developed system, which, having originated in remote centuries, must come into collision with the science of the present day. But he sets out from the consciousness of the Christian, from that internal experience resulting to the individual from his connection with the Christian community, and he thus obtains a material which, as its basis is feeling, is more flexible, and to which it is easier to give dialectically a form that satisfies science. As a member of the Christian Church, this is the point of departure in the Christology of Schleiermacher. 31 I am conscious of the removal of my sinfulness, and the impartation of absolute perfection. In other words, in communion with the Church, I feel operating upon me the influence of a sinless and perfect principle. This influence cannot proceed from the Christian community as an effect of the reciprocal action of its members on each other, for to every one of these sin and imperfection are inherent, and the cooperation of impure beings can never produce anything pure as its result. It must be the influence of one who possessed that sinlessness and perfection as personal qualities, and who moreover stands in such a relation to the Christian community that he can impart these qualities to its members. That is, since the Christian Church could not exist prior to this impartation, it must be the influence of its founder. As Christians, we find something operated within us, hence, as from every effect we argue to its cause, we infer the influence of Christ, and from this again the nature of his person, which must have had the powers necessary to the exertion of this influence. To speak more closely, that which we experience as members of the Christian Church is a strengthening of our consciousness of God, in its relation to our sensuous existence. That is, it is rendered easier to us to deprive the senses of their ascendancy within us, to make all our impressions the servants of the religious sentiment, and all our actions its offspring, according to what has been stated above. This is the effect wrought in us by Christ, who imparts to us the strength of his consciousness of God, frees us from the bondage of sensuality and sin, and is thus the Redeemer in the feeling of the strengthened consciousness of God, which the Christian possesses by his communion with the Redeemer. The obstructions of his natural and social life are not felt as obstructions to his consciousness of God. They do not interrupt the blessedness which he enjoys in his inmost religious life. What has been called evil and divine chastisement is not such for him, and as it is Christ who, by receiving him into the communion of his blessedness, frees him therefrom, the office of expiation is united to that of redemption. In this sense alone is the doctrine of the Church concerning the threefold office of Christ to be interpreted. He is a prophet in that by the word be, the setting forth of himself, and not otherwise, could draw mankind towards himself, and therefore the chief object of his doctrine was his own person. He is at once a high priest and a sacrifice, in that he, the sinless one from whose existence therefore no evil could be evolved, entered into communion with the life of sinful humanity, and endured the evils which adhere to it, that he might take us into communion with his sinless and blessed life, in other words, deliver us from the power and consequences of sin and evil 770, and present us pure before God. Lastly, he is a king in that he brings these blessings to mankind in the form of an organized society of which he is the head. From this which Christ effects we gather what he is, if we owe to him the continual strengthening of the consciousness of God within us. This consciousness must have existed in him in absolute strength, so that it, or God in the form of the consciousness, was the only operative force within him, and this is the sense of the expression of the Church. God became man in Christ. If further Christ works in us a more and more complete conquest over sensuality in himself, there must have been an absolute conquest over it in no moment of his life. Can the sensual consciousness have disputed the victory with his consciousness of God? Never can a vacillation or struggle have had place within him. In other words, the human nature in him was sinless, and in the stricter sense that in virtue of the essential predominance within him of the higher powers over the lower, it was impossible for him to sin by this peculiarity of his nature. He is the archetype, the actualization of the ideal of humanity, which his Church can only approach, never surpass, yet must have, for otherwise there could be no true fellowship between him and us have been developed under the ordinary conditions of human life. The ideal must in him have been perfectly historical. Each phase of his actual life must have borne the impress of the ideal, and this is the proper sense of the Church formula, that the divine and human nature were in him united into one person. Only thus far can the doctrine of the Christ be deduced from the experience of the Christian, and thus far, according to Schleiermacher, it is not opposed to science. Whatever in the dogma of the Church goes beyond theses, for example the supernatural conception of Jesus and his miracles, also the facts of the resurrection and ascension, and the prophecies of his second coming to judge the world, ought not to be brought forward as integral parts of the doctrine of the Christ. For he from whose influence upon us comes all the strengthening of our consciousness of God may have been the Christ, though he should not have risen bodily from the dead, and ascended into heaven, etc., so that we believe these facts not because they are involved in our internal experience, but only because they are stated in Scripture, not so much therefore in a religious and dogmatical, as in an historical manner. This Christology is undeniably a beautiful effort of thought, and as we shall presently see does the utmost towards rendering the union of the divine and the human in Christ conceivable. But if its author supposed that he kept the faith unmutilated and science unoffended, we are compelled to pronounce that he was in both points deceived. Science opens its attack on the proposition that the ideal man was historically manifested in the person of Christ. It did not escape Schleiermacher himself that this was a dangerous point. No sooner has he put forth the above proposition than he reflects on the difficulty of supposing that the ideal should be realized in one historical individual, since in other cases we never find the ideal realized in a single appearance, but only in an entire cycle of appearances, which reciprocally complete each other. It is true that this theologian does not hold the character of Christ as the ideal man to extend to the manifold relations of human life, so as to be the archetype for all the 771 science, art, and policy that are developed in human society. He confines it to the domain of the consciousness of God, but as Schmid has justly observed, this does not alter the case for the consciousness of God, also being in its development and manifestation subject to the conditions of finiteness and imperfection. The supposition that even in this department exclusively the ideal was manifested in a single, historical individual, involves a violation of the laws of nature. By a miracle, this, however, is far from alarming Schleiermacher. On the contrary, he maintains that this is the place, and the only place in which the Christian doctrine must necessarily admit a miracle, since the originating of the person of Christ can only be conceived as the result of a special divine act of creation. It is true he limits the miraculous to the first introduction of Christ into the series of existences, and allows the whole of his further development to have been subject to all the conditions of finite existence, but this concession cannot repair the breach which the supposition only of one miracle makes in the scientific theory of the world. Still less can any help be derived from vague analogies like the following, as it is still possible that matter should begin to agglomerate, and thence to revolve in infinite space, so science must admit that there may be in the domain of spiritual life an appearance which in like manner we can only explain as the commencement, the first point in a higher process of development. This comparison suggests the observation made by Brannis, namely, that it would be contrary to the laws of all development to regard the initial member of a series as the greatesto suppose that in Christ the founder of that community, the object of which is the strengthening of the consciousness of God, the strength of this consciousness was absolute a perfection, which is rather the infinitely distant goal of the progressive development of the community founded by him. Schleiermacher does indeed attribute to Christianity perfectibility in a certain sense, not as a capability of surpassing Christ in his nature, but solely in the conditions of its manifestation. His view is this: the limitation, the imperfection of the relations of Christ, the language in which he expressed himself, the nationality within which he was placed, modified his thoughts and actions, but in their form alone, their essence remained nevertheless the perfect ideal. Now, if Christianity in its progressive advancement in doctrine and practice rejects more and more of those temporal and national limitations by which the actions and teaching of Jesus were circumscribed, this is not to surpass Christ, it is rather to give a more perfect expression of his inner life. But as Schmid has satisfactorily shown, an historical individual is that which appears of him and no more. His internal nature is known by his words and actions, the condition of his age and nation are a part of his individuality, and what lies beneath this phenomenal existence as the essence is not the nature of this individual, but the human nature in general, which in particular beings operates only under the limitations of their individuality of time and of circumstances. Thus to surpass the historical appearance of Christ is to rise nearer not to his nature, but to the idea of humanity in general, and if we are to suppose that it is still Christ whose nature is more truly expressed, when with the rejection of the temporal and national, the essential elements of his doctrine and life are further developed, it would not be difficult by a similar abstraction to represent Socrates as the one who in this manner cannot be surpassed. As neither an individual in general, nor in particular the commencing point in an historical series, can present the perfect ideal, so if Christ be 772 regarded decidedly as man, the archetypal nature and development which Schleiermacher ascribes to him cannot be brought to accord with the laws of human existence impeccability, in the sense of the impossibility of sinning, as it is supposed to exist in Christ, is a quality totally incompatible with the human nature, for to man, in consequence of his agency being liable to guidance by the motives of the senses, as well as of the reason, the possibility of sinning is essential, and if Christ was entirely free from inward conflict, from all vacillation of the spiritual life between good and evil, he could not be a man of like nature with us, for the action and reaction between the spiritual nature in general and the external world, and in particular between the superior religious and moral powers, and the operations of the mind in subordination to the senses, necessarily manifests itself as a conflict. If on the one side the Christology in question is far from satisfying science, it is equally far on the other side from satisfying the faith. We will not enter into those points in which, instead of the decisions of the Church, it at least offers acceptable substitutes, concerning which, however, it may be doubted whether they are a full compensation. 35. Its disagreement with the faith is the most conspicuous in the position that the facts of the resurrection and ascension do not form essential parts of the Christian faith, for the belief in the resurrection of Christ is the foundation stone without which the Christian Church could not have been built, nor could the cycle of Christian festivals, which are the external representation of the Christian faith, now suffer a more fatal mutilation than by the removal of the festival of Easter. The Christ who died could not be what he is in the belief of the Church if he were not also the Christ who rose again. Thus the doctrine of Schleiermacher concerning the person and conditions of Christ betrays a twofold inadequacy, not meeting the requirements either of the faith of the Church or of science. It is clear, however, from his doctrine of the work of Christ, that in order to satisfy the former so far as is here done, such a contradiction of the latter was quite unnecessary, and an easier course might have been pursued for resting merely on a backward inference from the inward experience of the Christian, as the effect to the person of Christ, as the cause. The Christology of Schleiermacher has but a frail support, since it cannot be proved that that inward experience is not to be explained without the actual existence of such a Christ. Schleiermacher himself did not overlook the probable objection that the Church, induced merely by the relative excellence of Jesus, conceived an ideal of absolute perfection, and transferred this to the historical Christ, from which combination she continually strengthens and vivifies her consciousness of God. But he held this objection to be precluded by the observation that sinful humanity, by reason of the mutual dependence of the will and the understanding, is incapable of conceiving an immaculate ideal. But, as it has been aptly remarked, if Schleiermacher claims a miracle for the origination of his real Christ, we have an equal right to claim one for the origination of the ideal of a Christ in the human soul. Meanwhile, it is not true that sinful human nature is incapable of conceiving a sinless ideal. If by this ideal be understood merely a general conception, then the conception of the perfect and the sinless is as necessarily coexistent with the consciousness of imperfection and sinfulness as the conception of infinity with that of finiteness, since the two 773 ideas conditionate one another, and the one is not possible without the other. If, on the other hand, by this ideal be meant a concrete image, the conception of a character, in which all the individual features are portrayed, it may be admitted that a sinful individual or age cannot depict such an image without blemish, but of this inability the age or individual itself is not conscious, not having any superior standard, and if the image be but slightly drawn, if it leave room for the modifications of increased enlightenment, it may continue to be regarded as immaculate, even by a later and more clear-sighted age, so long as this age is inclined to view it under the most favorable light. We may now estimate the truth of the reproach which made Schleiermacher so indignant, namely, that his was not an historical, but an ideal Christ. It is unjust in relation to the opinion of Schleiermacher, for he firmly believed that the Christ as construed by him really lived, but it is just in relation to the historical state of the facts, because such a Christ never existed but in idea, and in this sense indeed the reproach has even a stronger bearing on the system of the Church, because the Christ therein presented can still less have existed. Lastly, it is just in relation to the consequence of Schleiermacher's system, since to effect what Schleiermacher makes him effect no other Christ is necessary, and according to the principles of Schleiermacher, respecting the relation of God to the world, of the supernatural to the natural, no other Christ is possible than an ideal one. And, in this sense, the reproach attaches specifically to Schleiermacher's doctrine, for according to the premises of the orthodox doctrine, an historical Christ is both possible and necessary. Christology interpreted symbolically. Kant de Wet. The attempt to retain in combination the ideal in Christ with the historical having failed these two elements separate themselves, the latter falls as a natural residuum to the ground, and the former rises as a pure sublimate into the ethereal world of ideas. Historically, Jesus can have been nothing more than a person highly distinguished indeed, but subject to the limitations inevitable to all that is mortal by means of his exalted character. However, he exerted so powerful an influence over the religious sentiment that it constituted him the ideal of piety, in accordance with the general rule that an historical fact or person cannot become the basis of a positive religion until it is elevated into the sphere of the ideal. Spinoza made this distinction when maintaining that to know the historical Christ is not necessary to felicity, but only to know the ideal Christ, namely, the eternal wisdom of God, which is manifested in all things in the human mind particularly, and in a preeminent degree in Jesus Christ, that wisdom which alone teaches man what is true and false, good and bad. According to Kant also, it ought not to be made a condition of salvation to believe that there was once a man who by his holiness and merit gave satisfaction for himself, and for all others, for of this the reason tells us 774 nothing, but it is the duty of men universally to elevate themselves to the ideal of moral perfection deposited in the reason, and to obtain moral strength by the contemplation of this ideal. Such moral faith alone man is bound to exercise, and not historical faith. Taking his stand on this principle, Kant proceeds to interpret the doctrines of the Bible and the Church as symbols of the ideal. It is humanity, or the rational part of this system of things, in its entire moral perfection, that could alone make a world the object of divine providence, and the end of creation. This idea of a humanity well-pleasing to God has existed in God from all eternity. It proceeds from his essence, and is therefore no created thing but his eternal Son, the Word, through whom, that is, for whose sake all things were created, and in whom God loved the world. As this idea of moral perfection has not man for its author, as it has been introduced into him, even without his being able to conceive how his nature can have been susceptible of such an idea, it may be said to have come down to us from heaven, and to have assumed the human nature, and this union with us may be regarded as an abasement of the Son of God. This ideal of moral perfection, so far as it is compatible with the condition of a being dependent on necessities and inclinations, can only be conceived by us under the form of a man now, just as we can obtain no idea of the amount of a force, but by calculating the degree of resistance which it can overcome, so we can form no estimate of the strength of the moral disposition, but by imagining hard conflicts in which it can triumph. Hence, the man who embodies the perfect ideal must be one who would voluntarily undertake not only to perform every duty of man on his own behalf, and by precept and example, to disseminate the good and the true around him as extensively as possible, but also, though tempted by the strongest allurements, to submit to all sufferings, even to the most ignominious death, for the welfare of mankind. In a practical relation, this idea has its reality completely within itself, and it needed no exemplification in experience in order to become a model binding on us, since it is enshrined as such in our reason. Nay, this ideal remains essentially confined to the reason, because it cannot be adequately represented by any example in outward experience, since such an example would not fully disclose the inward disposition, but would only admit of our forming dubious inferences thereon. Nevertheless, as all men ought to be conformed to this ideal, and consequently must be capable of such conformity, it is always possible in experience that a man may appear who, in his teaching course of life and sufferings, may present an example of a man well-pleasing to God. But even in this manifestation of the God-man, it would not properly be that which is obvious to the senses, or can be known by experience, which would be the object of saving faith, but the ideal lying in the reason which we should attribute to this manifestation of the God-man, because he appeared to us to be conformed to it. That is indeed so far only as this can be concluded from outward experience, inasmuch as all of us, though naturally generated men, feel bound, and consequently able ourselves to present such an example. We have no reason to regard that exemplification of the ideal man as supernaturally generated, nor does he need the attestation of miracles, for besides the moral faith in the idea, nothing further is requisite than the historical conviction that his life was conformed to that idea, in order to accredit him as its personification. He who is conscious of such a moral disposition as to have a well-founded confidence that under temptations and sufferings similar to those which are 775 attributed to the ideal man, as a touchstone of his moral disposition, he would adhere unalterably to this exemplar, and faithfully follow his steps. Such a man alone is entitled to consider himself an object of the divine complacency. To elevate himself to such a state of mind, man must depart from evil, cast off the old man, crucify the flesh, a change which is essentially connected with a series of sorrows and sufferings. These the former man has deserved as a punishment, but they fall on the new for the regenerated man, who takes them on himself, though physically, and in his empirical character, as a being determined by the senses. He remains the former man is morally as an intellectual being, with his changed disposition, become a new man, having by this change taken upon him the disposition of the Son of God. That which is strictly a substitution of the new man for the old may be represented by a personification of the idea, as a substitution of the Son of God. And it may be said that the latter himself as substitute bears for man, for all who practically believe in him, the guilt of sin, as a redeemer satisfies supreme justice by suffering and death, and as an intercessor imparts the hope of appearing justified before the judge. The suffering which the new man in dying to the old must perpetually incur through life, being conceived in the representative of mankind as a death suffered once for all. Kant, like Schleiermacher, whose Christology in many respects recalls that of Kant 41, carries his appropriation of the Christology of the Church no further than the death of Christ, of his resurrection and ascension. He says that they cannot be available to religion within the limits of pure reason, because they would involve the materiality of all existences still in another light. He employs these facts as symbols of the ideas of the reason, as images of the entrance into the abode of blessedness, that is, into communion with all the good, while Tiefdrunk has yet more decidedly given it as his opinion that without the resurrection the history of Jesus would terminate in a revolting catastrophe, that the eye would turn away with melancholy and dissatisfaction from an event in which the pattern of humanity fell a victim to impious rage, and in which the scene closed with a death as unmerited as sorrowful, that the history requires to be crowned with the fulfillment of the expectation, towards which the moral contemplations of every one are irresistibly drawn with the passage into a compensating immortality. In the same manner De Wet ascribed to the evangelical history, as to every history and particularly to the history of religion, a symbolical ideal character, in virtue of which it is the expression and image of the human mind, and its various operations. The history of the miraculous conception of Jesus represents the divine origin of religion, the narratives of his miracles, the independent force of the human mind, and the sublime doctrine of spiritual self-reliance. His resurrection is the image of the victory of truth, a foreshadowing of the future triumph of good over evil. His ascension, the symbol of the eternal majesty of religion. The fundamental religious ideas which Jesus enunciated in his teaching are expressed with equal clearness in his history. This history is an expression of devoted enthusiasm in the courageous ministry of Jesus, and in the victorious power of his appearance of resignation in his contest with the wickedness of men, in the melancholy of his premonitory discourses, and above all in his death. Christ on the cross is the image of humanity purified by self-sacrifice. We ought all to crucify ourselves with him, that we may rise with him to new life. Lastly, 776. The idea of devotion was the keynote in the history of Jesus, every moment of his life being dedicated to the thought of his heavenly Father. At an earlier period, Horst presented this symbolical view of the history of Jesus with singular clearness. Whether he says all that is narrated of Christ happened precisely so historically is a question indifferent to us, nor can it now be settled. Nay, if we would be candid with ourselves, that which was once sacred history for the Christian believer is, for the enlightened portion of our contemporaries, only fable. The narratives of the supernatural birth of Christ, of his miracles, of his resurrection and ascension, must be rejected by us as at variance with the inductions of our intellect. Let them, however, only be no longer interpreted merely by the understanding as history, but by the feelings and imagination as poetry, and it will be found that in these narratives nothing is invented arbitrarily, but all springs from the depths and divine impulses of the human mind. Considered from this point of view, we may annex to the history of Christ all that is important to religious trust, animating to the pure dispositions, attractive to the tender feelings. That history is a beautiful sacred poem of the human race, a poem in which are embodied all the wants of our religious instinct, and this is the highest honor of Christianity and the strongest proof of its universal applicability. The history of the Gospel is in fact the history of human nature conceived ideally, and exhibits to us in the life of an individual what man ought to be, and united with him by following his doctrine and example, can actually become. It is not denied that what to us can appear only sacred poetry was to Paul, John, Matthew, and Luke fact and certain history, but it was the very same internal cause which made the narratives of the Gospel sacred fact and history to them, which makes those narratives to us a sacred mythos and poetry. The points of view only are different human nature, and in it the religious impulse remains ever the same. Those first Christians needed in their world for the animating of the religious and moral dispositions in the men of their time, history and fact of which, however, the inmost kernel consisted of ideas. To us, the facts are become superannuated and doubtful, and only for the sake of the fundamental ideas are the narratives of those facts an object of reverence. This view was met immediately on the part of the Church by the reproach that instead of the riches of divine reality, which faith discovers in the history of Christ, it palmed upon us a collection of empty ideas and ideals, instead of a consolatory work, affected an overwhelming obligation for the certainty that God once actually united himself with human nature. The admonition that man ought to obtain divine dispositions offers a poor compensation for the peace which the redemption completed by Christ brings to the believer. It is no equivalent to put before him the duty of freeing himself from sin. By this system man is thrust out of the reconciled world, in which Christianity places him, into an unreconciled world, out of a world of happiness into a world of misery. For where reconciliation has yet to be effected, where happiness has yet to be attained, there is at present enmity and unhappiness, and in truth the hope of entire deliverance from these conditions, is according to the principles of this system, which only admits an infinite approximation towards the idea, a deceptive one, for that which is only to be reached in an endless progression, is in fact unattainable. But not the faith alone. Science also in its newest development has found 777, this system unsatisfactory. Science has perceived that to convert ideas simply into an obligatory possibility to which no reality corresponds, is in fact to annihilate them, just as it would be to render the infinite finite to represent it, as that which lies beyond the finite. Science has conceived that the infinite has its existence in the alternate production and extinction of the finite, that the idea is realized only in the entire series of its manifestations, that nothing can come into existence which does not already essentially exist, and therefore that it is not to be required of man that he should reconcile himself with God and assimilate his sentiments to the divine, unless this reconciliation and this assimilation are already virtually effected. The speculative Christology. Kant had already said that the good principle did not descend from heaven merely at a particular time, but had descended on mankind invisibly from the commencement of the human race, and Schelling laid down the proposition the incarnation of God is an incarnation from eternity. But while the former understood under that expression only the moral instinct which with its ideal of good and its sense of duty has been from the beginning implanted in man, the latter understood under the incarnate Son of God the finite itself in the form of the human consciousness, which in its contradistinction to the infinite, wherewith it is nevertheless one, appears as a suffering God subjected to the conditions of time. In the most recent philosophy, this idea has been further developed in the following manner, when it is said of God that he is a spirit, and of man that he also is a spirit. It follows that the two are not essentially distinct. To speak more particularly, it is the essential property of a spirit in the distribution of itself into distinct personalities to remain identical with itself, to possess itself in another than itself. Hence, the recognition of God as a spirit implies that God does not remain as a fixed and immutable infinite, encompassing the finite, but enters into it, produces the finite nature, and the human mind merely as a limited manifestation of himself, from which he eternally returns into unity, as man considered as a finite spirit, limited to his finite nature, has not truth. So God considered exclusively as an infinite spirit, shut up in his infinitude, has not reality. The infinite spirit is real only when it discloses itself in finite spirits, as the finite spirit is true only when it merges itself in the infinite. The true and real existence of spirit, therefore, is neither in God by himself nor in man by himself, but in the God-man, neither in the infinite alone nor in the finite alone, but in the interchange of impartation and withdrawal between the two, which on the part of God is revelation, on the part of man religion. If God and man are in themselves one, and if religion is the human side of this unity, then must this unity be made evident to man in religion, and become in him consciousness and reality. Certainly, so long as man knows not that he is a spirit, he cannot know that God is man. While he is under the guidance of nature, only he will deify nature, when he has learned to submit 778 himself to law, and thus to regulate his natural tendencies by external means, he will set God before him as a lawgiver. But when in the vicissitudes of the world's history, the natural state discloses its corruptions, the legal its misery, the former will experience the need of a God who elevates it above itself, the latter of a God who descends to its level, man being once mature enough to receive as his religion the truth that God is man and man of a divine race. It necessarily follows, since religion is the form in which the truth presents itself to the popular mind, that this truth must appear in a guise intelligible to all, as a fact obvious to the senses. In other words, there must appear a human individual who is recognized as the visible God, this God-man uniting in a single being the divine essence and the human personality. It may be said of him that he had the divine spirit for a father and a woman for his mother, his personality reflecting itself not in himself, but in the absolute substance, having the will to exist only for God and not at all for itself. He is sinless and perfect as a man of divine essence. He is the power that subdues nature, a worker of miracles. But as God in a human manifestation, he is dependent on nature, subject to its necessities, and, sufferinxis in a state of abasement, must he even pay the last tribute to nature. Does not the fact that the human nature is subject to death preclude the idea that that nature is one with the divine? No, the God-man dies, and thus proves that the incarnation of God is real, that the infinite spirit does not scorn to descend into the lowest depths of the finite, because he knows how to find a way of return into himself, because in the most entire alienation of himself, he can retain his identity. Further, the God-man, in so far as he is a spirit reflected in his infinity, stands contrasted with men, in so far as they are limited to their finiteness, hence opposition and contest result. And the death of the God-man becomes a violent one inflicted by the hands of sinners, so that to physical degradation is added the moral degradation of ignominy and accusation of crime. If God then finds a passage from heaven to the grave, so must a way be discoverable for man from the grave to heaven. The death of the Prince of Life is the life of mortals by his entrance into the world, as God-man. God showed himself reconciled to man by his dying, in which act he cast off the limitations of mortality. He showed moreover the way in which he perpetually effects that reconciliation, namely by remaining throughout his manifestation of himself under the limitations of a natural existence, and his suppression of that existence identical with himself, inasmuch as the death of the God-man is merely the cessation of his state of alienation from the infinite. It is in fact an exaltation and return to God, and thus the death is necessarily followed by the resurrection and ascension. The God-man, who during his life stood before his contemporaries as an individual distinct from themselves and perceptible by the senses, is by death taken out of their sight. He enters into their imagination and memory. The unity of the divine and human in him becomes a part of the general consciousness, and the Church must repeat spiritually in the souls of its members those events of his life which he experienced externally. The believer, finding himself environed with the conditions of nature, must like Christ die to nature, but only inwardly, as Christ did outwardly, must spiritually crucify himself, and be buried with Christ, that by the virtual suppression of his own sensible existence, he may become in so far as he is a spirit identical with himself, and participate in the bliss and glory of Christ. 779. Last dilemma. Thus, by a higher mode of argumentation from the idea of God and man in their reciprocal relation, the truth of the conception which the Church forms of Christ appears to be confirmed, and we seem to be reconducted to the orthodox point of view, though by an inverted path. For while there the truth of the conceptions of the Church concerning Christ is deduced from the correctness of the evangelical history, here the veracity of the history is deduced from the truth of those conceptions. That which is rational is also real. The idea is not merely the moral imperative of Kant, but also an actuality proved to be an idea of the reason. The unity of the divine and human nature must also have an historical existence. The unity of God with man, says Marhinek 47, was really and visibly manifested in the person of Jesus Christ. In him, according to Rosenkranz 48, the divine power over nature was concentrated. He could not act otherwise than miraculously, and the working of miracles which surprises us was to him natural. His resurrection, says Conradi 49, is the necessary sequel of the completion of his personality, and so little ought it to surprise us that, on the contrary, we must rather have been surprised if it had not happened. But do these deductions remove the contradictions which have exhibited themselves in the doctrine of the Church concerning the person and work of Christ? We need only to compare the structures which Rosenkranz in his review has passed on Schleiermacher's criticism of the Christology of the Church, with what the same author proposes as a substitute in his Encyclopedia, in order to perceive that the general propositions on the unity of the divine and human natures do not in the least serve to explain the appearance of a person in whom this unity existed individually, in an exclusive manner, though I may conceive that the divine spirit in a state of renunciation and abasement becomes the human, and that the human nature in its return into and above itself becomes the divine. This does not help me to conceive more easily how the divine and human natures can have constituted the distinct and yet united portions of an historical person, though I may see the human mind in its unity with the divine, in the course of the world's history, more and more completely establish itself as the power which subdues nature. This is quite another thing than to conceive a single man endowed with such power for individual voluntary acts. Lastly, from the truth that the suppression of the natural existence is the resurrection of the spirit, can never be deduced the bodily resurrection of an individual. We should thus have fallen back again to Kant's point of view, which we have ourselves found unsatisfactory, for if the idea have no corresponding reality, it is an empty obligation and ideal. But do we then deprive the idea of all reality? By no means. We reject only that which does not follow from the premises. If reality is ascribed to the idea of the unity of the divine and human natures, is this equivalent to the admission that this unity must actually have been once manifested, as it never had been, and never more will be in one individual, this is indeed not the mode in which idea realizes itself. It is not wont to lavish all its fullness on one exemplar, and 780 be niggardly towards all others. 51 to express itself perfectly in that one individual, and imperfectly in all the rest it rather loves, to distribute its riches among a multiplicity of exemplars, which reciprocally complete each other in the alternate appearance and suppression of a series of individuals. And is this no true realization of the idea? Is not the idea of the unity of the divine and human natures a real one, in a far higher sense, when I regard the whole race of mankind as its realization, than when I single out one man as such a realization? Is not an incarnation of God from eternity a truer one than an incarnation limited to a particular point of time? This is the key to the whole of Christology, that as subject of the predicate which the Church assigns to Christ we place, instead of an individual, an idea, but an idea which has an existence in reality, not in the mind only like that of Kant in an individual, a Godman. The properties and functions which the Church ascribes to Christ contradict themselves in the idea of the race. They perfectly agree. Humanity is the union of the two natures, God become man, the infinite manifesting itself in the finite, and the finite spirit remembering its infinitude. It is the child of the visible mother, and the invisible father nature, and spirit it is the worker of miracles in so far as in the course of human history, the spirit more and more completely subjugates nature both within and around man, until it lies before him as the inert matter, on which he exercises his active power. 52. It is the sinless existence for the course of its development, is a blameless one. Pollution cleaves to the individual only, and does not touch the race or its history. It is humanity that dies, rises and ascends to heaven, for from the negation of its phenomenal life, there ever proceeds a higher spiritual life, from the suppression of its mortality, as a personal, national and terrestrial spirit, arises its union with the infinite spirit of the heavens. By faith in this Christ, especially in his death and resurrection, man is justified before God, that is, by the kindling within him of the idea of humanity. The individual man participates in the divinely human life of the species. Now the main element of that idea is that the negation of the merely natural and sensual life, which is itself the negation of the spirit, the negation of negation, therefore, is the sole way to true spiritual life. This alone is the absolute sense of Christology, that it is annexed to the person and history of one individual, is a necessary result of the historical form which Christology has taken. Schleiermacher was quite right when he foreboded that the speculative view would not leave much more of the historical person of the Saviour than was retained by the Ebionites. The phenomenal history of the individual, says Hegel, is only a starting point for the mind. Faith in her early stages is governed by the senses, and therefore contemplates a temporal history. What she holds to be true is the external ordinary event, the evidence for which is of the historical forensic kind of fact, to be proved by the testimony of the senses, and the moral confidence inspired by the witnesses, but mind having once taken occasion by this external fact to bring under its consciousness the idea of humanity as one with God sees in the history, only the presentation of that idea, the object of faith, is completely changed. Instead of a sensible empirical fact, it has 781 become a spiritual and divine idea, which has its confirmation no longer in history, but in philosophy. When the mind has thus gone beyond the sensible history, and entered into the domain of the absolute, the former ceases to be essential, it takes a subordinate place above which the spiritual truths suggested by the history stand. Self-supported, it becomes as the faint image of a dream, which belongs only to the past, and does not, like the idea, share the permanence of the spirit, which is absolutely present to itself. Even Luther subordinated the physical miracles to the spiritual as the truly great miracles. And shall we interest ourselves more in the cure of some sick people in Galilee than in the miracles of intellectual and moral life belonging to the history of the world, in the increasing, the almost incredible dominion of man over nature, in the irresistible force of ideas, to which no unintelligent matter, whatever its magnitude, can oppose any enduring resistance? Shall isolated incidents, in themselves trivial, be more to us than the universal order of events, simply because in the latter we presuppose, if we do not perceive a natural cause, in the former the contrary? This would be a direct contravention of the more enlightened sentiments of our own day, justly and conclusively expressed by Schleiermacher. The interests of pity, says this theologian, can no longer require us so to conceive a fact that by its dependence on God, it is divested of the conditions which would belong to it as a link in the chain of nature. For we have outgrown the notion that the divine omnipotence is more completely manifested in the interruption of the order of nature than in its preservation. Thus, if we know the incarnation, death, and resurrection, the duplex negatio affirmat as the eternal circulation, the infinitely repeated pulsation of the divine life, what special importance can attach to a single fact, which is but a mere sensible image of this unending process our age demands, to be led in Christology to the idea in the fact to the race in the individual a theology, which in its doctrines on the Christ stops short at him as an individual, is not properly a theology but a homily. In what relation, then, must the pulpit stand to theologiae? How is the continuance of a ministry in the Church possible, when theology has reached this stage? This is the difficult question which presents itself to us in conclusion. Relation of the critical and speculative theology to the Church. Schleiermacher has said that when he reflected on the approaching crisis in theology, and imagined himself obliged to choose one of two alternatives, either to surrender the Christian history like every common history, as a spoil to criticism, or to hold his faith in fee to the speculative system, his decision was, that for himself considered singly, he would embrace the latter, but that regarding himself as a member of the Church, and especially as one of its teachers, he should be induced rather to take the opposite course for the idea of God and of man, on which according to the speculative system, the truth of the Christian faith rests, is indeed a precious jewel, but it can be possessed only by a few, and he would not wish to be that privileged individual in the Church who alone among thousands held the faith on its true grounds. As a member of the Church, he could have no satisfaction, but in 782 perfect equality in the consciousness that all receive alike both in kind and manner from the same source, and as a teacher and spokesman to the Church, he could not possibly attempt the task of elevating old and young, without distinction, to the idea of God and of man. He must rather attack their faith as a groundless one, or else endeavor to strengthen and confirm it, while knowing it to be groundless, as thus in the matter of religion, an impassable gulf would be fixed between two parties in the Church. The speculative theology threatens us with the distinction of an esoteric and exoteric doctrine, which ill accords with the declaration of Christ, that all shall be taught of God. The scientific alone have the foundation of the faith, the unscientific have only the faith, and receive it only by means of tradition, if the Ebionitic view on the contrary leave but little of Christ. Yet this little is equally attainable by all, and we are thereby secured from the hierarchy of speculation, which ever tends to merge itself in the hierarchy of Rome. Here we see presented under the form of thought belonging to a cultivated mind, the same opinion which is now expressed by many in a less cultivated fashion, namely, that the theologian who is at once critical and speculative must in relation to the Church be a hypocrite. The real state of the case is this: the Church refers her Christology to an individual who existed historically at a certain period, the speculative theologian to an idea which only attains existence in the totality of individuals. By the Church, the evangelical narratives are received as history; by the critical theologian, they are regarded for the most part as mere mythi. If he would continue to impart instruction to the Church, four ways are open to him. First, the attempt already excluded by the above observations of Schleiermacher, namely, to elevate the Church to his own point of view, and for it also to resolve the historical into the ideal, an attempt which must necessarily fail, because to the Church all those premises are wanting on which the theologian rests his speculative conclusions, and upon which therefore only an enthusiast for interpretation would venture. The second and opposite measure would be to transport himself to the point of view of the Church, and for the sake of imparting edification ecclesiastically, to descend from the sphere of the ideal into the region of the popular conception. This expedient is commonly understood, and judged too narrowly. The difference between the theologian and the Church is regarded as a total one. It is thought that in answer to the question whether he believes in the history of Christ, he ought to say exactly no, whereas he says yes, and this is a falsehood. It is true that if in the discourses and instructions of the spiritual teacher the main interest were an historical one, this would be a correct representation of the case. But in fact the interest is a religious one. It is essential religion which is here communicated under the form of a history. Hence, he who does not believe in the history, as such, may yet appreciate the religious truths therein contained equally with one who does also receive the history. As such, the distinction is one of form merely and does not affect the substance. Hence, it is an evidence of an uncultivated mind to denounce as a hypocrite a theologian who preaches, for example, on the resurrection of Christ, since though he may not believe in the reality of that event as a single, sensible fact, he may nevertheless hold to be true the representation of the process of spiritual life, which the resurrection of Christ affords, strictly considered. However, this identity of the substantial truth, 783, exists only in the apprehension of him who knows how to distinguish the substance from the form of religion. Roman 1, of the theologian, not of the church, to whom he speaks. The latter can conceive no faith in the dogmatical truth of the resurrection of Christ, for example, apart from a conviction of its historical reality, and if it come to discover that the theologian has not this conviction, and yet preaches on the resurrection, he must appear in the eyes of the church a hypocrite, and thus the entire relation between the theologian and the church would be virtually cancelled. In this case, the theologian, though in himself no hypocrite, would appear such to the church, and would be conscious of this misconstruction, if notwithstanding this, he should continue to instruct the church under the form of its own conceptions, he would ultimately appear a hypocrite to himself also, and would be driven to the third desperate course of forsaking the ministerial office. It avails nothing to say he has only to descend from the pulpit, and mount the professor's chair, where he will not be under the necessity of withholding his scientific opinions from such as are destined to science, for if he whom the course of his own intellectual culture has obliged to renounce the ministerial office should by his instructions lead many to the same point, and thus render them also incapable of that office, the original evil would only be multiplied. On the other hand, it could not be held good for the church that all those who pursue criticism and speculation to the results above presented should depart from their position as teachers, for no clergyman would any longer meddle with such inquiries, if he thus ran the risk of being led to results which would oblige him to abandon the ministerial office. Criticism and philosophy would fall into the hands of those who are not professed theologians, and to the theologian nothing would remain but the faith, which then could not possibly long resist the attacks of the critical and speculative laity. But where truth is concerned, the possible consequences have no weight. Hence the above remark ought not to be made. Thus much, however, may be maintained in relation to the real question: he whom his theological studies have led to an intellectual position, respecting which he must believe that he has attained the truth, that he has penetrated into the deepest mysteries of theology, cannot feel either inclined or bound, just at this point in his career, to abandon theology. On the contrary, such a step would be unnatural, nay, impossible. He will therefore seek another expedient, and as such there presents itself a fourth, which is not like the two first one-sided, nor like the third merely negative, but which offers a positive mode of reconciling the two extremest consciousness of the theologian and that of the church. In his discourses to the church, he will indeed adhere to the forms of the popular conception, but on every opportunity he will exhibit their spiritual significance, which to him constitutes their sole truth, and thus preparitho such a result is only to be thought of as an unending progress, resolution of those forms into their original ideas in the consciousness of the church. Also thus to abide by the example already chosen at the festival of Easter, he will indeed set out from the sensible fact of the resurrection of Christ, but he will dwell chiefly on the being buried and rising again with Christ, which the apostle himself has strenuously inculcated this very course. Every preacher, even the most orthodox, strictly takes as often as he draws a moral from the evangelical text on which he preaches, for this is nothing else than the transition from the externally historical to the inward and spiritual. It is true, we must not overlook the distinction that the orthodox preacher builds 780 for his moral on the text, in such a way that the latter remains as an historical foundation, whereas with the speculative preacher the transition from the biblical history or the church doctrine to the truth which he thence derives has the negative effect of annihilating the former viewed. More closely, however, the transition of the orthodox preacher from the evangelical text to the moral application is not free from this negative tendency. In proceeding from the history to the doctrine, he implies at least thus much: the history is not enough, it is not the whole truth, it must be transmuted from a past fact into a present one, from an event external to you, it must become your own intimate experience, so that with this transition the case is the same as with the proof of the existence of God, in which the cosmical existence, which is the point of departure, apparently remains as a foundation, but is in fact negatived as a true existence and merged in the absolute. Nevertheless, there remains a marked distinction between these two propositions, since and in so far as this has happened so, and so is your duty, and your consolation, and this is indeed related as having happened once, but the truth is that it always so happens, and both in and by you ought to happen. At least the community will not receive both as identical, and thus here again, in every excess or diminution, which the more or less spontaneous relation of the teacher to critical theology together with the variety in the degrees of culture of the community introduces danger, is incurred that the community may discover this difference, and the preacher appear to it, and consequently to himself, a hypocrite. In this difficulty, the theologian may find himself driven either directly to state his opinions and attempt to elevate the people to his ideas, or since this attempt must necessarily fail carefully, to adapt himself to the conception of the community, or lastly, since even on this plan he may easily betray himself in the end to leave the ministerial profession. We have thus admitted the difficulty with which the critical and speculative views are burthened with reference to the relation of the clergyman to the church. We have exhibited the collision into which the theologian falls when it is asked what course remains for him in so far as he has adopted such views, and we have shown that our age has not arrived at a certain decision on this subject. But this collision is not the effect of the curiosity of an individual. It is necessarily introduced by the progress of time and the development of Christian theology. It surprises and masters the individual without his being able to guard himself from it, or rather he can do this with slight labor if he abstain from study and thought, or if not from these, from freedom of speech and writing. Of such there are already enough in our day, and there was no need to make continual additions to their number through the calumniation of those who have expressed themselves in the spirit of advanced science. But there are also a few who, notwithstanding such attacks, freely declare what can no longer be concealed, and time will show whether by the one party or the other the church, mankind, and truth are best served. The end.